Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 9. As I've begun doing in previous episodes, I'd like to read some comments on previous subjects addressed, and then get into the topics for this particular week. Anyone wishing to write completely anonymously, please go to meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive. And some of the questions that I may not have addressed yet, don't worry, I read them all and I will be addressing them all in their good time. So you don't need to write again. As well as those topics that are more sensitive, feel free to write to me personally at my personal email address, Simon, S-I-M-O-N, at meaningfullife.com. So, we had many comments and reactions to last week's episode, and one particular one that I'd like to address, because we also have an additional source from the Rebbe regarding the issue of anger and negative feelings that people may have to each other, grudges and so on, which we discussed at length in the last episode as well as episode 7. So a writer shares the following, thanking us for doing this invaluable service, and pointing out a letter from the Rebbe from volume 3 in Igros Kodesh, page 197. The letter is written in Yiddish, but I'll translate it because of its interest and I think really relevant. Someone asked the Rebbe the following question. In Sefer Maimorim Yiddish, which is a book of discourses written and delivered in Yiddish by the Frierdiker Rebbe, some of them, most of them, in the time when he was in the United States. Page 216, this is what it says in the Sefer Maimorim, and someone's asking a question to the Rebbe about this. As Rab Nosson was a Chassidus gelegen in Midas v'al pidine atayr unkein v'turim for Midas Chassidus. That he followed the guidelines of the Torah and how one should react emotionally to situations without any compromises of the Midas of Chassidus. And then afterwards he says, seemingly a contradictory statement, Midas hataveni getan. But he did very little in Midas. He did little work in his emotions. How do these two statements reconcile with each other? On one hand, it says that he followed the Torah guidelines and Chassidic guidelines for how to behave, emotionally reacting to others, and then it says he didn't do much in it. The Rebbe answers the following, that in dealing with emotions, and he spells out, Ava v'sina, love and repulsion. You're attracted to someone, you like someone, or you're repelled by them. Yira prikasel. Yira would be awe. Prikasel would be total anarchy. Rachmanis v'achzorius. Compassion and cruelty. And similarly, consists of two different aspects. So dealing with emotions deals with two different aspects, the Rebbe writes. Firstly, that the midas, that the emotions should follow a reflective intellect in a form of iskafi. In other words, if a person, for example, has an inclination or impulse to behave and react a certain way to someone, so they first should reflect and ask themselves if that's correct, and if it's not, they should control themselves. And then step 2 is ibemachen de midas, which is hapche. The second is transforming that feeling, not just suppressing it, but actually transforming it. For example, the Rebbe brings an example. Someone has a competitor in business. And in the same district, not just a competitor in a different city, but in the same business district. Those are the Rebbe's words. So when he allows himself to follow his impulses and the emotions of his animal soul, so what happens? It arouses a sense of hatred and the being disturbed about his competitor. Comes the seichel, comes the intelligence of his divine soul, and says to him, you're a believer in God. You believe that God created the world and controls the world. So mamanavshach, either or. If God designated for you a certain amount of parnasa, a certain amount of livelihood, how could a competitor come and take that away from you? Which would be going against God's plan, God's desire. If, however, God decided to give you less parnasa, less income, less livelihood, do you think if you didn't have the competitor, they will not find another way above to not allow you to get the amount that you'd like to make? So bottom line, it won't help you having any type of hatred and resentment to this competitor. So why should you hate him? This is how the Rebbe gives example how the seichel, the intelligence of the divine soul, speaks to the animal soul. Now, once he allows the divine soul to speak to him again and again, he says, "No chasach tainen." After many arguments, and the mind tells him this again and again, at some point, the hatred and the resentment begins to subside, at least in his action, and then also in his speech, and ultimately also in his thoughts. But it's still not ishapcha. This is still not transforming it to love. This is just subsiding or controlling, suppressing this negative feeling. Then the Rebbe continues. The nefesh alikis geht aber weiter und sagt them. The divine soul continues, persists, and says to him, love your fellow like yourself. You're a specialist in that competitor's line. And you just determined that his business success cannot shot you, cannot in any way impact you negatively. So go ahead and help him with an eitzah teva, with some good advice, with a halva, with a loan, similarly. And then with this approach, ultimately the hatred that was initially there, the resentment, will turn to love. And this second thing is what it said in the mimer there, that he didn't do with midas. This requires work. So even though Rab Nosson followed everything correctly in the Torah, but he didn't work on himself to actually transform it. So the Rebbe has a final line. Even though according to the laws of Torah, you can find some excuse, some justification why not to do the second step, and only to suffice with step one. That's what Rab Nosson did, and that's what the Maimer is talking about. Obviously, this can be applied to many situations where a person has an emotional reaction to something and how to address it. In another letter, the Rebbe writes that I hope you accept my advice. As the Frierdiker Rebbe once said in the name of his uncle, the Razah, Rab Zalman Arden, who was the older brother of the Rebbe Rashab, he used to say that when a person gets angry and gets upset, one should wait at least 61 minutes, and then he can think objectively what he should actually do. So it's in the same vein of how one suppresses and then one how can transform. Very consistent to our discussion in Tanya, the end of chapter 12, of how one has to behave when they have this negative feeling and ultimately turn it into a positive one. Clearly, we're not perfect human beings. We'll make our mistakes, we'll have our reactions, but Chassidus has an approach to us, has a direction to us, a guideline of how to deal with negative feelings. So let's now go into the topics for this week's episode. We'll begin with doubts in God and Torah. So though no one should ever have any doubts in anything, and hopefully you can only find emes and truth, but we live in a world, as some call it, an agnostic universe. God himself concealed his presence, as is known in Kabbalistic and Chassidic thought, the Arizal's famous Tzimtzum doctrine, Seid HaTzimtzum, the secret of the Tzimtzum, concealed his presence, allowing us to think and feel that we're self-made, we're on our own. So it's inevitable there will be doubts, there will be questions. The question is how to deal with these doubts. So let me read some selection from a number of letters. Here's question number one. I happen to doubt the fundamentals of Judaism. I doubt everything. And without proof, I have a hard time giving my whole life over to it. Another question. I grew up in a very religious home, always doing the right thing. I was told to bring Mashiach. I worked hard at it. I was told to learn and daven. I made sure to do it right. Not only did I do it all, I loved it. I loved being devoted and close to God. My whole worldview had God in the picture. Why? Because I was taught God is everything and everything is God. So a tree had God's signature on it, the wind had God's feeling to it, learning had God's wisdom in it, so on and so forth. I believe there's a term called wiring. Doesn't necessarily mean brainwashing, but in some way every upbringing is a kind of brainwashing. I, together with thousands of other students, perhaps are wired in developing our sense of truth about life, existence, truth, purpose. For years and years, almost my whole life, I've repeatedly said the same words of prayer, talking to this invisible God. I've gone through thousands of papers about the beauty, depth, love, kindness, power of this invisible God. For most of my life, I have sat by Chassidic gatherings, singing, talking, and sometimes crying about my connection to God. We sacrifice so much for God. We circumcise our sons for Him. We give part of our money to Him. We have a very strict eating diet for Him. We talk about Him tens of times a day. Basically, God is our life. But in my case, one day I said, hold on 1 second here. You mean to tell me that all I just spoke about may all be a fairy tale? It may not be true. There's even a small chance that all that work and effort and emotional closeness may all be made up by some tribes, men a couple thousand years ago. That was my reaction when I first pondered on the idea. And I can go on and on. It's a rather lengthy letter, but I think you get the gist of it. The more I read about it, the more I started wondering whether I've not just been programmed. Today with the internet, and I'm reading the conclusion of that letter, I guarantee you thousands of our youth are being exposed to atheistic schools of thought and don't know how to handle it. That's what so many of us need, and more will need it. Not only do we need it, we can save the emotional and psychological catastrophes of youth when they end up dealing with this. So instead of being reactive, we should be proactive. It's not enough to just overflow smart youth with more Farbrengens and Chassidus. That just means when they are confronted with these dilemmas, the backfire struggle will be that much worse. Please address this critical topic. That's exactly what I will do to the best of my ability. Now, there are actually, I don't know if it's hundreds, but definitely tens and tens and tens, I would say hundreds of letters of the Rebbe to individuals who asked similar questions about doubts. Some of the letters focus on particular empirical and historical proofs of the Torah's veracity, of God's veracity. Obviously, quoting books and holy books prior to the Rebbe, of course. You have books like the Meir Nevuchim from Maimonides, the Kuzari, Rab Sadia Gaon, Amunas Videis. And throughout the generations, throughout the centuries, you have different approaches in addressing Cheves Halavavis that address the question of arguing the case for God, case for Torah, Sefer Ikrim from Yosef Albo. The list goes on. So there are many books, and obviously I'm not going to replace everything that's written in those books. Those are things anyone could look up. I want to approach it since in the name of Chassidus Applied from a Chassidus point of view. Some of those books are pre-Chassidus, some of them what we call Chkira, Jewish philosophy, Jewish thought. But there's also a Chassidic approach to it, which also includes some of these proofs. But the most intriguing thing, before I get to some of the specific arguments, is at the end of the day, any proof you give is clearly not absolute. How do we know this? Because look at the entire world. If we're such an absolute proof, why didn't people just follow God? Why do some people deny or question at least? I'll take a step further. What about people who are believers, total believers? Forget about whether it's programmed or not programmed. Do they follow life as if 24/7 God is with them? So why do we make mistakes? Why do we sin, even deliberately? Because the answer is, even with all the proofs in the world, and even with all your good intentions, God is concealed. And even Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, almost 2,000 years ago, told his students on his deathbed, Halavai, may it be that your fear of other people, your fear of God should be as powerful as your fear of other people. And this is not in our modern age. This is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the greatest sages, and his students who were great sages. Why? Because the fact of life is, God is invisible. And as such, when you wake up in the morning, you feel your own presence, you feel the material world around you, and you need to remind yourself, Moida Ani. You need to tell yourself there's a God in this world. Lev Yitzchak Barditchever once announced in Barditchev, he said, Everyone, please come together and gather together Tuesday afternoon, 3 o'clock. No one knew why, but they thought maybe there's a decree in heaven. Rav Levi Yitzchak says that. So everybody closed their stores, schools closed, everyone came to shul, 3 o'clock sharp. Rav Levi Yitzchak walks into the Beis Medrash, he claps on the bimah, bangs on the bimah and says, I want everyone to know, and everyone's anticipating, what is he going to tell us? I want everyone to know that there's a Rabbeinu Shalom in this world, there's a God in this world. And then he left. That was it. That was the punchline. To remind people there's a God. Because even the most faithful and even the most pious, bottom line is, as Levitza Baditch was said elsewhere, that we feel the physical world and we read about the spiritual world. He says to Hashem, what's the kunz? Try it out the other way around once and you'll see how they behave. Let them feel and experience the spiritual, the divine, and let them read in the books about the material and we'll see then how they behave. Because the Gashmizdika world has a hold on us. It's exactly the way the plan was meant to be. The soul comes down to earth. It's made to forget the Torah consciously. And the rest of life is a struggle. The whole of Tanya is based on that struggle. Not a bad struggle, a positive struggle to bring the best out of us, but it's a question, it's a struggle. The Arizal, with the Tzimtzum, explained it theologically. Explained how is it possible that we should have such a distortion? That reality is the divine and we're a novelty. In the language of Chassidus, alakus b'pshitas and elam is b'schachus. How suddenly did it turn upside down? That the glove suddenly became the hand and the hand became like the glove. That our physical reality is natural to us and God is the question, God is the novelty. Famous story of the debate between a chassid and non-chassid about the God. And finally it wasn't going anywhere. So the chassid in an exasperated tone says to the individual, the philosopher, he says to him, I envy you because you think about God all the time. And I must tell you, I think about myself most of the time, or all the time. The philosopher was very respectful of this rabbi, was very flattered. And with that, they parted ways. And for years, he thought, what a compliment. And he would tell everybody, he was proud about it, proud of it, and would boast. Even that great chassid that everyone respected, said, he thinks about himself all day, I think about God. Different versions of the story, but the end of the story is that one day he's reminded by someone, you're a fool. The chassid actually insulted you, but it did it in such an intelligent way that you thought it was a compliment. The reason he told you think about God all day and why he thinks about himself all day, because for you exist. That's a given. Your question is, does God exist? So you think about God all the time. Does he exist? Does he not exist? Maybe. How does he exist? For the chassid, God is a given. He doesn't have to think about it. His question is, do I exist? So he thinks about himself all the time. Do I exist? How do I exist? Is this an illusion? Is it real? Did God really put me here? For what purpose? Etc., etc. This isn't just semantics. It's a different perception. So the Tzimtzum of the Arizal explains that type of agnostic universe. So let's state it very loud and clear. You can give proofs from today till tomorrow. Yeah, people are the most pious Jews, most pious people, and yet they also fall because God is invisible. God created a world where it's possible to deny his existence and definitely possible to feel he's not watching. Different reality. As Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said. So number one is let's not be afraid of doubts and let's not be afraid of questions. It comes with the turf. That's what life is all about. That's the way God created it. At the end of the day, it's God himself who concealed himself in this best possible way. They say Christopher Hitchens, who was Jewish, said, and he was a self-proclaimed, he wouldn't call himself absolute atheist, but 99% atheist, agnostic. You always leave a little room because you can't disprove God's existence either. So they asked him, what happens when you come up? He died from cancer prematurely 2 years ago. When was it? And they asked him, what happens when you come up and you find out there was a God? So he said he's going to ask God, why did you conceal yourself so well? I found that to be an interesting answer. That's the story. Yes, God concealed himself. So the fact that we have questions is legitimate, and the fact that we have to struggle is legitimate. The question is, will you allow that doubt to paralyze you or not? So you have a series of proofs, as I mentioned, from the different holy books. Nothing can create itself. the design of the universe testifies to a creator, to a designer. There's no painting in the world that does not testify to an artist. A book testifies to its author. A piece of music testifies to its composer. So why would one not say that a world that is far more beautiful than any painting, more eloquent than any music, more powerful than any book, does not have a creator? Everywhere else we don't have it. We say it would be ridiculous to deny that. So I submit there are many reasons, because saying that this building has an architect or this painting has an artist has no consequences. Why not? Whereas saying that there's a God that created me and you and the rest of the world has consequences, because maybe then I'm accountable. And if I'm accountable, I'm responsible. And frankly, who wants to be accountable and responsible? So there's a very nice way to explain why God is an inconvenience. And you could argue that maybe everybody's brainwashed using this letter. Maybe everybody's wired. The people who brought up in a agnostic home or an atheistic home are wired that way. Maybe religious people are wired that way. And the bottom line is, if you really think about it, you may have arguments for, arguments against, and maybe if you went purely objectively without any self-interest, you have to make a decision. What's more likely? Now, I'm not even using the arguments of Yisrael Naminim B'nei Maminim, that we're people of faith and children of faith, and everyone has faith, which I'll get to in a moment. I'm just speaking now about the topic itself. So number one is, doubts comes with the turf, as I said. It's part of life. It's the way the universe was created. And an interesting irony here is God did conceal himself in such a powerful way that he made sure that you can't prove it absolutely, because if you not only could prove it, if it was so real to you, you wouldn't be able to sin. If you saw elikus, godliness, in everything you do, how is it possible that you would transgress? As the classic example, would a human being, a normal person, put their hand in fire? No. So if you saw the effect of a mitzvah, the positive effect, and the negative, damaging effect of a sin, who in their normal mind would act that way? That's why the Gemara says, a person doesn't do a sin unless there's a moment of blindness, of insanity, shtus. Not one, frankly, that you can use in court of law as a defense, but a blindness, a moment of insanity. Because if you really knew the impact, no way you would do that. So it's God himself that concealed. So what are you going to do? Go fight with God's concealment? He wants it that way. The Gemara tells an interesting story. When Moshe Rabbeinu read the Chumash, or heard from Hashem, Teresh B'Ksav, Nasa Adam b'tzalmeinu kidmusenu. God said, let us create a human being in our image, in our form. So Moshe said, us. People are going to misinterpret and think that us means that there's a plurality, a duality above. When we know Hashem Echad, fundamental Jewish principle. What's God's response? Person who wants to make a mistake will make a mistake. To think, what kind of answer is that? Why did God actually do that? And what kind of answer is that? Because that's life. Those that want to make a mistake will make a mistake. But because of the fools will God destroy his own world. He created a world for a purpose. And the purpose includes the possibility to make a mistake, the possibility for the choice that we have to make, the possibility that we may take the concealment literally and think that the really divine doesn't exist, God forbid, or be wise enough to pierce the darkness, to pierce that concealment, and understand, first with our minds and then with our hearts, that there is a higher divine purpose, there's a God, there's a purpose for our lives, and so on. In a psyche that the Rebbe edited, Mishpatim Tavshin Mem Vav, it's printed in the Likutei Sichos, volume 26, in the Hesofis, and the editions there. It's a sikha about radio, a very fascinating sikha about Seder Shtalshus. The Rebbe added a line, I remember, in the edits, where he spoke about that, Ein Eid Mulvade, there's nothing but God. And the Rebbe writes, but that's Al Pi Seichel, Aval Bahar Goshaseinu. He wrote those words. But in our feeling, it's not that way. That's the challenge. Our minds may understand it. As I mentioned, there are many arguments, but the heart, Gamva Pumachtarta Rachmanakaria, is the natural result. You can pray to God to help you steal. How is that possible? You believe in God, and how could you have such dissonance? Because that's the reality, the concealment of the divine. Now, you may say, okay, this is not a proof. My point is, all the proofs in the world may not make a difference. That's what Avram Avinu came to. You read the beginning of the Rambam's Hilchos Avodah Zarah. It's a fascinating read. He talks about how idolatry came into existence. It didn't come someone decided, let's bow to a tree or to a stone or to an idol. What happened was that God was invisible and human beings wanted something on their terms. We want something that I can identify with. And what happened? They started identifying stars, cosmic entities, constellations. That became for them, it was simply Gaza biyad ha'chetzev. It was like an axe in the hand of an axeman. This was a way for we to identify to God through the majesty of His world. God's fingerprints, footprints, however you put it, fingertips. Then the next generation came and said, 1 second, that's too far for us too. Let's create something down on earth that we can relate to, we can come to, we can touch. That corresponds to that star, which corresponds to that divine entity that God placed into the heavens. And slowly this went from dechi al dechi, went lower and lower, then became a whole entity. Then some said, you know what? This is a good commercial opportunity. There are people coming to worship this stone, this tree, this location. Let's build a sanctuary around it, charge money, and hence became the religious commercial business. Of what? Of all trying to find something to identify with on your terms, until the point they forgot about the star forgot about the divine, and now this became an end in itself. Abraham came, like he says, came the Eson HaGadol, the great power force, Abraham, and realized there's this pagan world, something seriously wrong, and began retracing the steps. He realized it's not here on earth, it's not. Then he thought maybe it's in heaven. He realized it's not that. Came to realize there's something, a mystery going on. And what was his ultimate conclusion? Most interesting, fascinating conclusion was that he's making a mistake in the whole process of looking for God. Because if God created us, how can the part identify the whole? We're only a part of existence. We have a purpose. We were placed here. So how could the one that's placed, the creature, define the creator? Basically, Abraham said, I don't want a God that's the product of human logic and human equations and a mathematical equation, because then it's a product of my mind. He realized that he has to reverse the process. For me to find God, I have to stop being so aggressive and looking at it on my terms. I have to shut down all my senses and see what emerges. And he realized a deeper reality emerged. Here's not the place to go into this in depth and detail. The point is that the God that Abraham discovered, that later he embraced and committed his life to, Lasis Daka and Mishpat, build a life, not just a God, a philosophical God. He built a life based on morality and ethics and total commitment, which is what we follow till this day, which ultimately led to the Jewish nation and Matan Torah and so on. What we follow till this day, this was a pioneer of the highest order. A person who didn't buy into the masquerade, didn't buy into the commercialization of how human beings created their own self-worship or extension of self-worship, because that's at the end of the day what Avodah Zarah is. It's not just worshiping a stone, it's you're worshiping yourself. You want a God on your terms, not a God on God's terms. Instead of us understanding we were created in the divine image, we create a God in our image. That's the great sin, because you have to ask yourself, what's the big thing someone worships Avodah Zarah? Why is it such a cardinal sin equated with murder and incest? What does God care? People want to be foolish. They want to bow down to a tree, to a stone, to an object. The answer is because it undermines and is antithetical to the whole basis of real faith of God, which is, it's not about you. It's about getting beyond you. It's about something higher than yourself and submitting to it. So you want a God on your terms with your logic? The bottom line is that though there are proofs and there are arguments for God's existence and for the Torah's veracity and its value and how it's passed on, and many, many proofs that the Rebbe brings about, all the witnesses, the Rambam's classic proof and the Kuzri's classic proof of historical proof of how do you know George Washington exists? You weren't there because there were enough people who were witnesses and documented it. The Torah had millions of witnesses as opposed to other faiths that based on one or two people. All these proofs, the reason I'm not elaborating is because for every proof you can have an argument against it if you want to really push it. At the end of the day, you have to make a choice. That's what it comes down to. Adults have to make a choice. Weigh it all. Acknowledge your subjective interests Of all the scientists in the world, I always ask scientists that I know, I say, I understand you accuse religious people of being fanatics and not rational. And they've just been brainwashed with their faith. But what about you? You're supposed to be open-minded. Why don't you begin with a disclaimer, which is a famous way everyone knows in science you have to have a disclaimer, total transparency. And say, I'm going to give you arguments against God, but I have to tell you that I have personal interest in that. The only one I saw that did that is Aldous Huxley. He writes clearly, I'm invested in having no God because I want to do what I want to do, and especially, he writes, in the sexual arena. So at least he gets points for honesty. Which means that we're all subjective human beings. We make choices based on our subjectivity. And I say this across the board. Both people growing up in religious homes, people growing up in non-religious homes. And it's true, at some point, as an adult, you have to embrace what you've been taught. You have to make it your own. Own it. And just to buy into it because your parents said so, there's a very beautiful Torah from the Baal Shem Tov. He asks in Shemoneh Esrei, we say every day, 3 times a day, Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu Elokei Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov. Our God, the God of our fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's in the wrong chronological order. It should have said Elokei Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. Then it should say Elokei Aviseinu, and then Elokeinu. Why does it go the other order? And he explains. He says, because in education, when you're educated, it's in order. First you learn about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then you learn the God of your parents. Your parents teach that to you. But when you become an adult, you're supposed to become Elokeinu. You should be serving a God that is your God, has become personal, has become yours. Not just serving Elokei Aviseinu and Elokei Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov. After you have that, you should also know that you're standing on the midget, stands on the shoulders of giants, that it comes from a faith that was passed on to us, which is also inherent within each of us. I know an atheistic doctor. He calls himself an atheist. He's a researcher. He's decided to conquer 3 illnesses, more obscure ones. And he puts his resources, all his life is passionately involved in healing those, finding a cure. 3 incurable diseases. So I always ask him, whenever I see him, comes to my classes from time to time. I know I have people that call themselves, they call me the rabbi of atheists at times. So he comes and I always ask him, I said, how are you so sure that you're going to find a cure? Maybe you just won't. Maybe it's a mutation, maybe it's something incurable. No, absolutely sure, everything can be cured. So I said to him, you sound like a fanatic, a religious fanatic. You just call yourself an atheist. You believe, you don't call it God, you call it nature. You call it healing, you call it science, whatever. Where do you have that absolute conviction? So that's a whole other discussion that Levi Yitzchak Berditchever said to a self-proclaimed atheist. The God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. If we want to have a real discussion about God, we have to put on the table all our definitions of God, all our definitions of Torah, dispel myths and stereotypes, because let's be honest, a lot of it has been passed on to us, not necessarily exactly purely how the Torah puts it. And maybe once we define what it really is, we may not have a disagreement. If most of us who have a nursery school image of God and think that God is like a guy that sits on a throne in heaven with a long white beard waiting to strike us with lightning when we misbehave, I probably would call myself an atheist too. And I'm sure many others would. So you have to have a definition of God, a sophisticated definition, understanding God is about a reality that's greater than ourselves and beyond us. I will elaborate more on this topic, but I want to just say one final note in this episode, and more will be continued in future episodes. We have to make a choice in this world. Yes, you can choose anarchy, that there are no rules, no guidelines, no God, no Torah, God forbid, and do whatever you want. Yes, you can make such a choice. What are the conclusions of that choice? A life of selfishness, of narcissism, most likely not leaving anything on earth that will preserve a legacy. Or you can make a decision of a responsible one. And this is not based purely on logic. It's based on logic, but plus some type of measure, what we would call faith. Faith is not the absence of reason. Faith is the acknowledgement that my logic brought me till here, and then there's another step that I need to embrace based on things that are more than just pure mathematical calculations. Okay, so hopefully I addressed it to some extent. And as I said, I'm sure there are more questions and much more to say, and I will leave it for future episodes. We need to keep the suspense going, so can't always answer everything to the completest sense, besides the fact that I may not have complete answers anyway. I'm just trying to share the Chassidic approach, which is without getting into arguments, not getting into debates. The Torah begins, Bereshis bara Elokim. The Torah doesn't prove God's existence. It says, God, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. In Chassidus, you'll find elsewhere some proofs, but most focus is on experiencing God, experiential proof, as opposed to a logical debate which can go on forever and ever, as I said, and not get anywhere. So the choices have to be made. Let's move on to the next. I was asked the following question, and this is back to the topic of what we call the unspoken impulse, part 3. Due to the many aspects of your discussion on Chatas Nurim, can you please sum up the Chabad Chassidus perspective? Yes, we did discuss this from different angles. So let me just sum it up briefly as I can, and maybe add one or more 2 points to it. And as I said, to then go on to the next subject as well. There's 2 key elements that we discussed. One is a method when dealing with sexuality, dealing with thoughts like this, and especially dealing with it pre-marriage, when a person has perhaps the greatest challenges around this. Those challenges usually spill over afterwards as well, but that's where the challenges begin. So the general approach was one that begins with not focusing on it, but distracting yourself by focusing on positive things, thoughts, even neutral thoughts, other passionate experiences, and especially in Torah. So, and that it becomes a process of conditioning. We spoke about several steps of how one does that. There's impulse control, which is discussed in chapter 12 in Tanya and those earlier chapters about this topic. There's transcending and coming to a state of transcendence where you don't allow it to become an issue that haunts you and bothers you. And then there's conditioning, which means where a person continues to work on their cognitive, emotional, and behavioral discipline to a point where these issues become less powerful. So the Chassidus approach is through bringing light into it. I mentioned the Sikha, the talk from the Rebbe Simchas Beis HaShe'eva Tovshin Yudalid, 1953 that would be. We discuss a beautiful Sikha about this, about the discussion about Simchas Beis HaShe'eva. I would suggest you look that up. But the bottom line is that the idea is to be positive and not allow this to become a haunting force, not the guilt around it, and not trying to repair it, and so on. Additionally, when you work on all this, it starts evoking within you also the Nekudas Hayad, which is the spark of the divine, which is in each of us, and coupled with all the methods that discussed, begin to become, as I said, a force that can begin to discipline your life. Is it going to be perfect? It may not be. But if you have a conscientious and a deliberate effort, guaranteed that will help. Now, of course, preemptive medicine is always best, and we discussed that, and that I don't want to go over again because I've discussed that at length. Preventive means the earlier you nip it in the bud and you don't allow something like this to become a monster, the more effective. And that's obviously the most effective way to go about it. Regarding the tikkunim that you find in Ageres HaTshuva and in chapter 7 in Tanya, which means, from the Rebbe's perspective, these tikkunim come later, if at all, after marriage, not initially. Initially, you just have to push it away and focus on other things, because focusing on the tikkun is focusing on this thing as well. Even for married people, it appears, I can't say conclusively, it depends what level you are, I guess, it appears that too is still the approach of focusing on the positive. But nevertheless, someone who's obviously working on themselves, and the Alter Rebbe is addressing all types of people, there is, whether it's the fasting, whether it's the different tshuva that he talks about, etc., that connects to it, whether it's charity. Maybe the bottom line, especially for a bocher, for a student, is to take the high road and immerse yourself into Torah and Chassidus, the Torah Shalom that I discussed at length, and not allow yourself to liegen blotten. The best way is to take your passion and direct it towards very positive things. The koyach hamesav, as we've discussed, the power of pleasure that is not manifesting in a tziyurah, in a shape and in garments that are soiled, but directing it in the holy, or at least neutral activity. Obviously, the holier the better. The second thing we discussed was the inner mechanics of how this works. That's the Torah Shalom. The Torah Shalom talks about how that works, how pleasure affects the mind, and how when you use that mind to have pleasure in Chassidus, in Pnimis HaTorah, you actually can rewire yourself. That is the discussion of Torah Shalom. But that already is the rewiring of it and the process of how it works. The bottom line I'd like to say, and I haven't put it quite in these words, is this. There's a very thin line between spirituality, between sensuality, and between sexuality or intimacy. It's a very thin line. Because once you open up the forces of the soul, it becomes far more complicated in all areas. And you see this from halacha. Bezdin would send shluchim, messengers, during Yom Tov, Moedim l'Simcha, when there was a lot of joy and drinking. Bezdin would send messengers to make sure that the boundaries, gender boundaries, were maintained. Why then? Because when the soul opens up through either joy or through any sensual celebration, it begins to affect the sexual attitudes of human beings. So there's a very thin line that goes both ways. That's why you'll find that many of the gurus, many of the spiritual gurus that don't have these disciplines are very much hedonistic in very decadent ways in this area. Because once you're dealing with someone on an intimate level, soulful level, things open up, defenses are down, people are talking about their innermost feelings. You're one step away, as I said, spiritual, sensual, sexual. Which is why so much great care has to be taken, and that's why maybe the Alter Rebbe went so adamantly, because realizing Chassidus is going to open up spiritual channels, and therefore needs a special great care. At the same time in Torah Shalom, he says, it's Chassidus that can correct the issue, because Chassidus, spirituality and divine spirituality, is precisely the force that can counter this intense pleasure and intense temptation. So this is an additional point that I wanted to throw in. And therefore, the best way to deal with it is to channel that sensuality and that spirituality into the proper places, or else it can spill over and cause negative and even destructive effects. Knowing this mechanism empowers you with the belief that it's doable, which in turn is a critical step in winning any battle, knowing that you can prevail. Because as he says in Tanya, when you think you're weak and you think you can't prevail and you become overwhelmed and demoralized, that you already begin to lose the battle. So a big critical point is to understand the mechanism, to understand that the same forces that tempt somebody in this area can be directed in a different place without deprivation and ultimately transform yourself. Obviously, once there's marriage and there's a sacred union between husband and wife, there's an outlet for it in a sacred way, as we discussed as well. Two more things I want to just add quickly about this that I had not mentioned, just to really fill in the whole picture. In that talk in Simchas Beis She'eva, in Tavshin Yudalid, the Rebbe speaks about Morash Cheda that I just mentioned, had the terrible effect of being depressed about these matters. That all eliminating, we call the call, as he says there, completely, any form of negative feelings and guilt, because that just feeds the problem. One thing, and he also brings there something which I neglected to mention, bris peh, that there's a zgula. When a person speaks cleanly, their speech, which is also called bris, is also called a covenant. When speech is clean, it also has a way of weakening the hold of that temptation, of the unspoken impulse, as we discussed it. It protects from it. Okay. Hopefully I covered this many different angles, summed it up, and we can go now to the next topic. Smoking pot and other drug use. I hope that doesn't bring a smile to your face. But yes, this is a question that has come to us. Many people have written to us about this. I decided to wait until I gathered my own thoughts and did some research on it. So here's a few questions on this topic. What's the difference between drugs and alcohol? Why can we say l'chaim and not smoke pot? Another questioner writes, without LSD, I would not be a practicing Jew. It woke me up to my soul and ignited my faith in God. It brought me back to my roots. What's your opinion on that? Would you advocate LSD or other alternative methods to discover God? Another question. Growing up in a Jewish home, in a Jewish school, we were always told that drugs are bad, of course. And of course, the drug that is closest to all of us is pot. By the time I was 16, my friends and myself, we were smoking pot, and I was hanging out with them and began to be exposed to it. I chose not to join them because of the constant reminder ringing in my head saying it's a bad drug, don't do it. But the more I familiarized myself with the drug, I began to realize that it's not exactly what I was told it was. But I was not yet ready to try it. I began to do hours of research about the topic to see what is real. Now I've been smoking pot periodically on and off for 3 years. First I couldn't handle it, and then slowly I accepted, then I stopped, and I went back to it. Now it's become a temptation, and I'm really not sure what is wrong with it. And I don't really find the reason that why should I not have it. I love my life and I enjoy pot. I have drawn several lines for myself, of course, to not go crazy, and I keep to them very well without a problem. I'm up every morning, 7 a.m. from mikveh, chassidus, shachris, shiurim. I'm not even in yeshiva, but I always keep questioning myself for some reason whether I'm doing something wrong. I know I'm not addicted. First of all, I hear it's impossible to be addicted to pot, and if you want to say you can get addicted to the feeling, I was out of the country for a month and it didn't faze me one bit. I was just the same. I don't know if I'm thinking it's wrong because is it because of a social stigma or something more to it. Okay, these questions are just a reflection of quite a number of ones in different words, but I think it covers the spectrum. Excellent questions, and they should be addressed very bluntly and directly, especially in the context of alcohol and l'chaim and so on. So let me begin with a letter. A letter from the Rebbe, which is actually about LSD. This letter is in English, from the Chav Cheshvan, Tavshin Chav Hey, 5725. I'm in receipt of your letter, the Rebbe writes, to someone in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which, by the way, in those years, in 65, is when Timothy Leary and others who dropped out of Harvard began embracing this drug. I'm in receipt of your letter, which you write in the name of your friends and in your own behalf, and ask my opinion regarding the new drug called LSD, which is said to have the property of mental stimulation, etc. The Rebbe writes the following. Biochemistry is not my field, and I cannot express an opinion on the drug you mentioned, especially as it is still new. It was still legal then, for the record. Because remember, it's a chemical that was developed by Albert Hoffman in the late 40s, early 50s. However, I added that. It's not what it says in the letter. So the Rebbe says, biochemistry is not my field, and I cannot comment on it. However, what I can say is that the claim that the said drug can stimulate mystical insight, etc., is not the proper way to attain mystical inspiration, even if it had such a property. The Jewish way is to go from strength to strength, not by means of drugs and other artificial stimulants, which have a place only if it is necessary for the physical health, in accordance with the mitzvah to take care of one's health. I hope that everyone will agree that before any drugs are taken, one should first utilize all one's natural capacities, and when this is done truly and fully, I do not think there will be a need to look for artificial stimulants. Then the Rebbe continues, I trust that you and your group, in view of your yeshiva background, have regular appointed times for the study of Torah and the inner aspects of the Torah, namely the teaching of Chassidus, and that such study is in accordance with the principle of our sages, namely the essential thing is the deed, the actual conduct of the daily life in accordance of Torah and mitzvahs, prayer, tefillin, kashrut, etc. This is only a matter of will and determination, for nothing stands in the way of the will. I trust that you are also using your good influence throughout your environment. I especially read the end as well because it's not an aside. It's how the Rebbe always concludes many letters dealing with any issue, including an issue like this. The letter speaks for itself and tells us the following. Number one, how one reaches spiritual, mystical insights, if that's the objective. That this is not the way, even if it achieves it. And we see this. Nadav and Avihu is the first burnout in Jewish history. In Parsha Shmini, and then Acharei Mos, talks about Nadav and Avihu. What did they do? The temple was established. In their ecstasy and excitement and their great spiritual hunger, as the Eira Chaim writes, they rushed into the temple. And they brought an Eish Zara as the expression, a foreign fire. It's an interesting word. in this context. And as a result, they died. In their ecstasy, and later, B'krevi HaKadosh, Hashem tells Moshe that these were my closest. They were sanctified God's name. But then afterwards, in Parsha Achrei Moshe Bnei Aaron, God gives the guidelines, Yayin v'shecher al teish, you shall not drink wine or beer. Basically, here is B'zeis Yovei, here is how you enter a spiritual dimension called the Holy of Holies. So that's the first experience. We have the 4 people who went into the Pardes. Rabbi Akiva, Ben Azai, Ben Zema, and Acher, Elisha ben Avuya. And only one came out intact. One died, one went mad, one became an apostate, and Rabbi Akiva, Nichnas b'shalom v'yotze b'shalom. The Pardes is considered to be a spiritual experience. Chassidus language is Rotzei without a shuv. There's a mimer from the Rebbe Rashab, Achrei Meis Tofresh Memtes, where he elaborates on this, based on other maimarim. So the idea of a spiritual high, and let's start with the spiritual, there's a way to do it, there's a way you earn your way, and any type of artificial method is not the way, from strength to strength. I'll just embellish on this a bit. If you go and try to induce it and force it, so even if you have it, as the Rebbe says, it's not yours. You have not earned it, so you don't own it. And therefore, when you go back down, you can't come home with it. You can't come back to tell about it. And I've interviewed and spoken to many people who've tried some of these more psychedelic, and they're called mystical experiences. And it's true, some did discover God through it, which I'll address in a moment. But integrating it in life is not so simple. And as you see, the Rebbe concludes the letter, study Torah, study Chassidus, bring it into action. There's no shortcuts. There's no magic pills. No pun intended. There's no buttons to press. It's a process. Spiritual growth is a process. So that's regarding the spiritual motivation, if someone wants to make that argument. The fact that Chassidim drank alcohol, mashke, was not for spiritual highs. It was to get rid of the inhibitions so they can be more open and speak more from their soul. It never replaced Torah and mitzvahs, God forbid. And that's why the Rebbe came out aggressively, and there's a letter already, I found a letter in Tavshin Yud Gimel. Tavshin Yud Gimel, Ches Kislev, in volume 7, page 58, Igris Kodesh, the Rebbe's letters, where he already makes a big case how times are different today. You can read the letter for yourself. And basically, I would say that alcohol and drugs are, in our time, very similar for that reason. If it's coming to replace, and that's how you're going to get a spiritual high, absolutely unacceptable. We'll soon address other aspects of this. That's not the way. That's not the method. The method is, we've been given the time-tested method. Now, what about those people that have gone through it? Like the person who asked this question, they found God through it. After the fact, there are people who found God through Buddhism. There are people who found it through other methods that may not be at all even halachically permissible, but we live in an assimilated, bizarre world. And in a strange way, maybe God planted reminders of God in crazy places. That's like any tshuva. You may have done something really wrong, and then that brought you to a thirst to find God, so you're able to zdenis, nasalei kazachis, you can transform your past. Not the sin, as we were taught. Shvirosin zeu takanosin, you have to eliminate the past behavior. But you may take out the fruit, like you discard the peels, but the fruit, the lessons that you learn from it. Like the Gemara says, matzoish shiitziu be'isur, the pillows that she offered to a certain individual in sin, later became pillows when he married her in Beheter. Permissible. The Rebbe brings this in a number of places. So what do we have here is, think of it this way. Imagine someone falls into a coma, God forbid. And nothing can help. The doctors have given up hope. One doctor says, give him an injection of drugs that would kill any normal person. Maybe it'll shake up his system. In that situation, you have nothing to lose. The drugs help. He's revived. So would anyone go around and say, okay, these are the drugs we should all be embracing? Therefore, a person in a comatose state, unhealthy, it woke you up. Now, find ways to access the God, the spirituality, through methods that are Torah methods. In addition to, we're not getting into the destructive or dangerous elements that are related to drug use, which goes into the There's a tshuva, an answer from Ramesh Feinstein about pot, health-related or other drugs. I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to get into all the health issues. But if a drug is also health challenging, and there are people who overdosed, and there are people who died, God forbid, so that goes into another discussion about health. But that goes into the whole area that this method is one that is not initial. And even after the fact, the circumstances as I just described, that way someone can argue after the fact, but never initially. But let's address this even more, especially regarding pot, which is not necessarily done for mystical experiences, maybe for other reasons. Some people say it's a recreational drug. I feel better. I feel calmer. What's wrong? Just like I take a drink, just like this, I feel calmer. You know? Yes, I'm not replacing it. I'm not using this as a replacement for serving God, even though some argue that it helps open you up to those things. But we discussed that part. The problem ultimately with drugs, and the same with alcohol, is self-indulgence. The whole purpose of life is you were created. Your soul came down to earth. Was sent down to earth for a purpose, to serve a higher cause. Self-indulgence is not what you were sent for. So every form of self-indulgence is not exactly conducive to fulfilling your life's mission. So that, I'm not necessarily going to call it a sin, but it's completely antithetical in spirit to the idea of a chassid, of a person who's serving a higher purpose. You found something that is very self-indulgent, makes you feel good, makes you feel better, less inhibitions, calmer, but it's about yourself. How does this make you a better Jew? How does this make you a better chassid? Are you serving better? Now, I know some argue that it helps them serve better. Well, on your terms, you've decided this is what you need to serve better. So the same thing, if someone needs a drink every morning, it's the same problem. Which leads me to point number 2, escape. Escapism. Escapism is not a way for healthy people. We all have our escapes. Let's not overdo this. We have our escapes. But an escape that becomes something that you become dependent on, which will lead me to the next point, is an escapism. And live a life of escapism is not exactly tachlis habriya. It's not the purpose of your existence again. That's why you find the idea of being responsible. You have a difficult day, a challenging day. You know something? If it talk about medical, even then I would say a medical thing that alters a person's consciousness in order to make them calmer, I don't know how much value there is to that. If a person is in serious anxiety attacks and a doctor recommends something, then it goes already into medication area. We're not discussing medication. But just to become a recreational type of drug, and for that matter, this goes with any type of addiction. This includes gambling, obviously sexual, pornography. It includes drinking, alcohol. It becomes something that you're escaping into or self-indulging into. That's not the spirit of Judaism. Now, why would a person go there? Let's go back to a topic I just addressed a number of times. Because one is bored, and they don't have another outlet. Guaranteed, if you had a passionate way, the Rebbe puts in the letter, that before one takes drugs, one should first utilize all of one's natural capacities. So that's he's talking about a mystical experience. But in general, if you had a passion that excited you, why would you need something to induce it? And then there's a third point, and that point is about being enslaved. A human being, avodei atem v'lo avodim. We are God's servants, as I said, to serve a higher cause. To be enslaved to anything, and this goes across the board, this isn't just drugs and alcohol, anything that controls you instead of you controlling it is demoralizing, is an assault on human dignity, and ultimately an assault on the divine image in which we were created. The divine image has made you master of your destiny, has made you master over your life. Not master in an arrogant way, but in a responsible way. La'ov de l'shamra, you were sent to this earth for a purpose. The purpose was to transform the world. You have everything you need. There was a chassid who the Rebbe Rashab told him to say Tikkun Chatzos at night, every midnight. Once he missed it, he fell asleep. He told the Rebbe Rashab he fell asleep. The Rebbe Rashab was so disturbed, he said to him, Wie kommt es, as Aid is nishkin balabos of sein eigener Körper? How is it possible that a Jew is not in control of his own body? Okay, the Rebbe Rashab standard. The point is that we all obviously are human beings and we have our weaknesses. But you have to understand what all this means. When you're addicted to something, it becomes the master, you become the slave. And someone will say, well, you know what? I like this slavery. I like this form of slavery. It makes me feel good. I don't feel enslaved. Responsible people building a family, a home. Ask yourself, you have children. Would you want your children to start smoking pot at the youngest of ages? Why not? So you say, well, it's for adults. What does that mean for adults? Adults are what? Adults who have already the maturity to indulge, the maturity to escape. Happy people are happy from within. There's nothing that's going to make you happy from outside. And if you cannot elicit such happiness, and you need to create something, some type of state of consciousness that makes you happy, may not be a problem per se in the worst crime on earth, but is the seeds, a breeding ground for issues. No question about it. So, I am not a rabbi paskening now and saying things are forbidden, not forbidden. I'm talking from a Chassidic, applied Chassidus perspective. One wants to talk about drugs, let's talk about it openly and bluntly. Now, I know I'm going to get many arguments, especially people who experiment or are involved in this, but ask yourself, if it comes an argument from someone who's involved in it, you are somewhat subjective. I consider myself pretty objective here. I may be subjective about other areas, but you look at it from a distance. I've seen people in different circumstances, and I look at it and I see its impact. It may be subtle, and it definitely goes against the spirit of what the Torah talks about and our obligations in this world. And I would challenge anyone to show me someone who's I'm not talking about someone who tried pot once, but someone who's actively involved in it, makes them more responsible, more committed to being a shliach, a shlucha, to the Rebbe's cause, to Torah, to God, to mitzvahs. Yeah, I'm sure you could find it doesn't contradict always, like this individual, but I do not see it as being the driving force that makes a person a more passionate messenger of God on this earth. Okay. With time being short, I will go to the next question. I want to just add one thing, since we're already on the topic. I did have one more thing I'd like to add. The Rebbe once told somebody about an observation about drugs in Yechidus in a private audience. I'm not sure who it was. He said that the last point that I just made, so just confirming what I just said, a person should be the master over his or herself. An enslavement of any sort is wrong. So this just confirms, and I wanted to bring this because it's actually Yechidus. So if anyone has information when this Yechidus was, with whom, I would definitely appreciate it. I like to cite all sources, but the Rebbe did speak about it. There isn't a lot of more material on it. There's definitely the spirit of the ideas are addressed, and I want to finally say about alcohol and mashka the same thing. The Rebbe's Gezerah was not just some type of Gezerah Sarkosa from heaven. It's connected to a reason, connected to our times, and connected how people drink. The drinking of Chassidim Amol, Yireh Shamayim, who worked on themselves for hours and hours and hours, and then they said some l'chaim on Purim or on Simchas Torah or other times to remove, as they say, the sirchus of the behemoth, to remove the blocks, to remove the scars, etc., in order to be able to be more open and so on, was a step at best. And at the same time, the Rabbeim still said it's a dover mo'os, something that's ekeldik, which means repulsive. And the Rebbe brings also one of the letter from Tafshin Yud Gimel that I heard from my father-in-law that he said, I am now like after mashke. And the Rebbe makes it very clear that even though it was for medical reasons, in truth it was because times were changing. And times are changing. Now you can achieve the same things through other methods, much more natural and healthy methods, without having to resort to a dependency. And Chassidish addiction is still an addiction. Even though the person may be a Chassidish Yid, an addiction is an addiction that makes you dependent on something that's not godly, something that's man-made, something that is a man. So ultimately, it's ultimately not mastery over yourself. So I just wanted to tie it up with that last piece. As I said, being that time has run out, I will not be able to address other issues, which I did want to address. We'll have to move them to the next episode. So I would like to thank you all for listening to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 9. And I look forward to sharing more and discussing more, receiving your questions as we go to episode 10 next week. Thank you very much.